Hi, this is Joy Ting from the Virginia Winemakers Research Exchange, and I'm here with Harvest Tips for Winemakers, tip number 12, stir after inoculation. This tip comes out of some feedback we heard last year from people using a new generation of rehydration nutrient that doesn't require as many attemperation steps before the yeast is pitched. People using the nutrients loved how quickly inoculations could be made, but they felt that the fermentations were sometimes slow to get started. Further investigation revealed an underlying issue with the inoculation methodology some winemakers were using. To start, I'll say that yeast manufacturers recommend mixing or adding inoculant to the bottom of the tank, then racking juice on top. However, many winemakers add inoculant to the top of the juice without mixing, with the assumption that the yeast will make its way down the juice column on its own. In their 2019 paper titled Distribution of Yeast Cells, Temperature, and Fermentation Byproducts in White Wine Fermentations, authors Schwinn, Turner, Delgado, and Fisher tested this assumption. Using Riesling juice each time, they had 3 different tank configurations. One was a very tall, skinny pilot scale tank holding a maximum volume of 105 liters with a height to diameter ratio of 14. They also tested 2 production scale tanks, one at 2,500 liters and the other at 7,000 liters, each with a height to diameter ratio of 2. These tanks were outfitted with sensors to measure sugar depletion, temperature, fermentation byproducts, and yeast cell counts at heights from top to bottom. There are many fascinating findings in this paper, but the take-home message is that it takes much longer than we think for yeast to fall to the bottom of the tank. When you really think about it, that makes sense. As soon as the yeast start to move down the juice column, they produce CO2 bubbles that push any cells above them back toward the top of the tank, impeding their progress. Schwinn et al. Found that sugar depletion at the top of the tank began as early as day 2 post-inoculation, while there was no difference in sugar content measured in the middle or the bottom of the tank until day 6. Meanwhile, yeast counts were much higher on top and much lower further below. These differences were completely gone if the tank was stirred post-inoculation. So what difference does that make in wine quality? Active yeast concentrated at the top of the tank likely leads to nutrient depletion, competition, and potentially yeast stress. In this paper, they saw production of compounds associated with diacetyl production later, as well as compounds that will bind SO2, depleting the free sulfur. At the bottom of the tank, the microbial community is very different. With few Saccharomyces around, there is much more time and opportunity for activity of potentially spoilage microbes. Also, if samples for fermentation monitoring come from the tasting valve, the measurement will show higher sugar and lower temperature than further up in the tank. In this study, the overall fermentation rate was also slower in tanks that were not mixed. So why haven't we always seen this effect? Previous rehydration strategies required a higher volume of juice addition to adapt yeast to the temperature of the juice. When adding a larger volume, you're much more likely to have better mixing just due to the mass of the volume added. Though this paper studied stratification in white wine fermentations, it's likely that red wine fermentations will have even more localized effects at inoculation. So it's probably best to mix those two. For more harvest tips or to find other resources, you can find them all at the Winemakers Research Exchange website. All of our resources are open source thanks to generous funding from the Virginia Wine Board.